Bonjour tout le monde. Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's online event featuring Dr. Zubin Austin, who will be discussing removing barriers to employment for IEHPs. Before we begin our webinar today, we would like to begin with an acknowledgement that N4 is hosted at CHIO, which is located in Ottawa, Ontario. Ottawa is built on unceded Algonquin and Anishinaabe territory. The peoples of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe Nation have lived on this territory for millennia, and we honor them and this land. Their culture and presence have nurtured and continue to nurture this land. We also honor all First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples, and their valuable past and present contributions to this land. My name is Colleen Drake. I am the Project Engagement Coordinator with N4. I use the pronouns she, her. I will be hosting and moderating today's presentation along with my co-host Andrew Toolmeyer, who will be monitoring the Q&A box today. I am now pleased to introduce you to today's presenter. Dr. Austin, I am going to ask you to turn on your video as I introduce you. Welcome. Dr. Zubin Austin is a professor at Dr. Zubin Austin is professor and Murray Koffler Research Chair at the Leslie Dan Faculty of Pharmacy and the Institute for Health Policy, Management, and Evaluation, Temerty Faculty of Medicine at the University of Toronto. His research focuses on the professional and personal development of the health workforce. He has published over 250 peer-reviewed papers and authored 4 textbooks. In 2017, in recognition of the global impact of his work, he was installed as Fellow of the Canadian Academy of the Health Sciences, one of the highest honors for health researchers in Canada. He is also the only University of Toronto professor ever to have received both the President's Teaching Award for Excellence as an Educator and the President's Research Impact Award for the societal significance of his work. He has been named Professor of the Year by students on 20 separate occasions. I will just do a few housekeeping slides. Today's session is being recorded and will be uploaded to our N4 platform. We will share this with you as soon as it becomes available. Should there be technical issues during this webinar, we will inform you with details for an alternate makeup session. Before we begin today's event, I would like to take a moment to introduce you to our platform features to help enhance your participation experience. Throughout today's session, we invite you to write your questions in the Q&A window. We know that sometimes you might have the same question or be interested in a particular response. Today, you have the option of upvoting a question. Please upvote questions you're interested in hearing the answer to, and we will prioritize which questions we pose to the speakers first. Our speaker today has, no conflicts of interest to declare. And with that said, let's jump right into today's presentation, and I will pass the virtual podium over to Dr. Austin. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to your group and for the kind introduction, Colleen. And let me, before we get started, acknowledge that I am sitting today on the traditional lands of the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat, and the Mississauga people. And especially this month, with National Day for Truth and Reconciliation fast approaching, I hope these sorts of land acknowledgements, which we hear frequently, aren't just something we do in a perfunctory way, but we actually all are able to think meaningfully about why we do these acknowledgements and their significance. And especially because so many of you who are doing work in this area will be funded by a federal ministry with the title Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada. And I believe N4 is funded by that branch of government as well, too. If we think about for our own Indigenous Canadians and First Nations, what it means to be an immigrant, a refugee, and have citizenship in Canada. The presentation today was called Removing Barriers to Employment for IEHPs. And I confess this was not actually a title that I came up with. It was a title that N4 suggested I use, and I was very happy to use it for a variety of reasons. First of all, it's because what could be wrong with a title like Removing Barriers to Employment for IEHPs for a group listening to this webinar? What I hope you consider in the next 45 minutes or so as this presentation proceeds is there could be plenty wrong with framing the collective problem we are attempting to solve as one of simply removing barriers to employment for IEHPs. I have been involved more directly and less directly in working with IEHPs for close to 25 years. What I'd like to share with you today is my experience of how framing of the issues facing IEHPs has evolved rapidly, considerably, and in somewhat diametrically opposed ways over that period of time. What I consider some of the potential dangers, but some of the opportunities that may exist if we can find ways of framing the issues in ways that resonate with the Canadian public, with government, with payers, with policymakers, and with healthcare practitioners in diverse fields. A simple framing of the issue as removing barriers may simply not be as effective as we think it ought to be in helping to mobilize political action, activity, and interest in an important issue. And so to begin with, I'd like us all to reflect a little bit on what's the problem we're trying to solve here. And I would say over my 25 years of work in this field, the answer is it really depends. At various times, the problem that has actually driven government funding, practitioner interest, and public scrutiny of practices associated with IEHP integration has really changed. There have been times where workforce shortages and imbalances have been the driver. There have been other times where perhaps more lofty and idealistic social justice considerations have been what has driven the agenda. At other times in the last 25 years, issues of fairness and legal considerations, including what does the Canadian Charter have to say about some of our practices and policies, have driven the agenda. Today, political pressures and wage inflation are important issues that we need to contend with and make sure that we're emphasizing in trying to reach the diverse audiences we all need to reach. I'll give you the end of the presentation now by saying this to me is the core issue. Social framing of the IEHP problem is always evolving, and those of us who are working in this field need to evolve with it and not simply stick to old ideas that it's all about integration or licensure or fairness. At different times and in different ways, calls for justice, calls for dealing with workforce shortages are simply not going to work with the audiences that we need to listen and to act. And so with that, let me start with just a brief history of IEHPs in Canada, one that most of you will be very familiar with. As we all know, IEHPs, immigration and IEHPs as a subset of immigrants to Canada have been a constant part of our growth and evolution as a country. This is part of our mosaic as an immigrant-receiving nation. We are not alone in this regard. Many immigrant-receiving nations, including, for example, the United Kingdom, Australia, the United States, also have similar kinds of stories to tell. But part of Canada's unique story, of course, is the way in which colonial and post-colonial reliance on other countries' standards have shaped our view and our practices. We also have an increasingly sophisticated Canadian education and regulatory system that overlays on this immigration dynamic. And as most of us are aware, there is a large and perhaps increasing disconnect between federal immigration aspirations and practices, what employers in various sectors need, as well as the way provinces spend their healthcare dollars and how provincial regulatory bodies, particularly in healthcare, interpret and apply their mandate. All of this means that the brief history of IEHPs that I'm going to be covering in the last 25 years is an incredibly tangled and complicated story, which is why trying to figure out what are the dominant themes and what are the most resonant messages that are likely to lead to success in advocacy, in fundraising, and in political action is so important. For many of us who are attuned to this story, many of us first become aware of the IEHP quote unquote problem from legendary stories of doctors driving taxis. The story of brain waste, the story of skills not being used to their fullest potential, and the human tragedy of doctors driving taxis is the sort of thing that many Canadians feel badly about. And for the early years of the IEHP project, that sense that isn't it so awful, this poor, hardworking new Canadian is driving a taxi cab rather than performing surgery, that was a powerful kind of storyline that actually mobilized political action. Today, the question of whether that kind of storyline would mobilize similar political action is, of course, a question. And what it really speaks to is the way in which various governments, and I'm going to be mainly focusing on my own government here in Ontario, has actually understood the problem of IEHPs and what have been the main drivers for political and policy action to address issues faced by IEHPs. You'll see the time frame I'm going to be covering here ranges from about the mid-1990s to today. And in that time period, there have been, in my mind, 10 distinct shifts in the discourse, 10 distinct and very different ways in which certain kinds of vocabulary and messaging have had different kinds of influence on politicians, funders, payers, and employers. The risk is if we remain stuck in a late 1990s paradigm of explaining the importance of our work, it simply doesn't work in 2022. If we are not changing our messaging, changing our advocacy approaches, and changing the way we highlight the significance of this issue to diverse stakeholders, we are not going to be doing the best possible job in helping IEHPs. Remember the title of this presentation? Removing Barriers to Employment for IEHPs? I would respectfully suggest in 2022, this might be the wrong message. Of course, we want to remove barriers to employment for IEHPs, but if that's the kind of language we're using to advocate to these different stakeholders, it's a message that may be falling on deaf ears. It's a message that might not actually activate political will in the way that we want to. And so thinking very carefully and reflecting on the history of how Ontario has understood the IEHP situation might help us to understand where we're going today and into the future. Let me then start with what happened in the, I'm sorry, my mouse is a little bit hypersensitive here, in the early years of work in the IEHP space. My first foray into this began in the mid-1990s, about 1994. And during this time, the historical experience of international medical graduate programs was what shaped understanding across all professions about what was going wrong with our system of integration. During this period of time, what was being seen was that systematic, consistent, and decades-long underinvestment in post-secondary education across diverse health professions was leading to severe shortages in many professions, including pharmacy, nursing, rehabilitation medicine, you name it. The simple fact that we did not have enough spaces in Canadian universities to graduate the number of healthcare professionals our system needed meant that there needed to be some remedy to ensure our healthcare system would actually function. Interestingly enough, in Ontario, the first branch of government that became interested in IEHPs was not the Ministry of Health. It was, in those days as it was known, the Ministry of Training, Colleges and Universities, MTCU. They were amongst the first groups within government to actually put serious money behind trying to resolve the issue. For MTCU, the issue was, frankly, that it was far cheaper to sponsor development of bridging education programs to help internationally qualified professionals get licensed in Canada than it was for MTCU to actually spend enough money to open new medical schools, pharmacy schools, nursing schools, etc. It was a sheer economic calculation that MTCU, rather than health, was going to take the lead. Training colleges and universities took the lead in this, and because it came out of that educational culture, this led in the mid-1990s to the development of bridging education programs that exist to this day, in which professionals from other jurisdictions who are trying to get licensed take Canadian education modules and programs benchmarked to Canadian curricula to help them to meet competency standards and expectations. During this period of time, the metric that MTCU was most interested in was licensure exam success. They defined their job as done if a large number of IEHPs simply got licensed to practice their profession. It saved provincial ministries of training college and universities the money that they would have had to have spent in order to build new college campuses and hire new professors. But it also addressed the problem that health was facing from a skills shortage perspective. This type of thinking, vocabulary, and framing of the problem is what led many universities, including my own at the University of Toronto, to become interested in this space. And to this day, we see that legacy in the ways in which bridging programs are very closely affiliated in many cases to college and universities. But as time evolved, as the economy evolved, and as needs changed, we had a shift in the discourse. By the late 1990s, as skills shortages started to subside, interest from the Ministry of Training Colleges and Universities also started to subside somewhat. And the discourse started to shift away from let's get people licensed to save the system money in opening new universities to a question of fairness. In the late 1990s in Ontario and other kinds of jurisdictions, what we started to see was the rise of fairness commissioners. As IEHPs became licensed, as IEHPs became a larger and more vocal political subgroup, they began to advocate in certain ways. And from the IEHP perspective, they were not that interested in saving MTCU money. What they perceived were systematic barriers that were fundamentally unfair. And the vocabulary of fairness became more prominent. By the late 1990s, if you were appealing only to skills shortages as the reason to get funding, you were likely not going to be as successful if you appealed to a broader social justice interest in fairness. This also started to coincide with the time where charter challenges became more common, where professionals from a diverse group of professions were starting to launch legal cases against regulatory bodies, against licensing exam bodies, and even education institutions, claiming that there was systemic discrimination and that the vocabulary of competency assessment was actually a shield to prevent fairness from occurring. Around this time, you saw regulatory bodies and licensing bodies using terms like communicative competence, language training, and English for specific purposes as ways of managing this, and claiming we're not being unfair, we're mainly safeguarding Canadian standards. The vocabulary of fairness started to dominate thinking and action in this area. And then it became really important for those of us working in the field to align our efforts with fairness commissioner offices, with legal standards, and an evolving legal understanding of how the Canadian Charter actually applied to IEHPs. This was also the time where ethical concerns about brain drain from source countries really started to come to the fore. As skills shortages started to abate and become less prominent, fairness became a focus for work in this field. By the early 2000s, we had well passed the point where you could get funding for programs, you could build political will and public interest in this area by worrying about skills shortage. Canadian urbanization and immigration patterns by this point had fairly clearly entrenched a two-tier healthcare system in Canada. Urban and suburban areas in most of Canada were actually well served by the healthcare workforce. Skills shortages in these areas were not a major public policy concern. Where skills shortages were a major public policy concern were in rural and underserviced areas, a pattern that exists to this day. But of course, in our political system, the political needs and the political voice of those in rural and underserviced areas simply don't carry as much clout as those in suburban and rural areas. And as that dynamic started to shift, the early 2000s was characterized by a period of saturation and redeployment. It became increasingly acceptable to no longer talk about skills shortages or even worry that much about fairness. But instead, the Ministry of Health started to enter this arena to support what they called rational deployment of the health workforce. This is the time where we started to see arguably ethically questionable practices like return service agreements, differential licensure categories, and other techniques designed to force IEHPs as a quid pro quo condition for licensure, go work in a place that other Canadians don't want to work in order to prove that you are ready. This is where the vocabulary started to shift away from communicative competency to cultural competency. In an environment where there was not as pressing a need for healthcare professionals as there was about a decade earlier, if those of us involved in the field were not talking in the language of workplace saturation and redeployment, we were less likely to be successful either in receiving funding or in actually advocating politically for what was necessary. A very abrupt discontinuity point occurred in 2008. It might seem strange in 2022 to refer to it in this way, but those of us who are old enough to remember 2008 will know that it was characterized by a crisis in the banking sector that triggered a worldwide recession. The economic crisis followed by recession gutted funding for a variety of different programs, including post-secondary education in general, as well as demand for healthcare professionals. It was a rather abrupt shift in workplace dynamics, and in some fields, Canadian grads had difficulty finding full-time work. And all of a sudden, the fairness discourse around IEHPs shifted dramatically. Around this time, studies showed that approximately 18% of medical subspecialists could not get jobs in their field. 18% of medical subspecialists who were educated and fully qualified in Canada could not get jobs in their fields. Concern about IEHP's experiences was moving way to the back of the agenda of political importance. Immigration continued, but the overall workforce marketplace was shifting considerably. Because of the economic trauma of the Great Recession, we were also starting to see a period of rapid increase in university tuition, particularly in health fields like medicine, dentistry, pharmacy, and rehabilitation medicine. Now, all of a sudden, I always tell the story to my own students in the pharmacy program at University of Toronto. In the mid-1980s, when I was educated and qualified as a pharmacist, my tuition in pharmacy school was $768 a year. By 2008, that had increased to $14,000 a year. And today, in 2022, it's closer to $25,000 a year. A variety of other university-based healthcare fields have seen similar astonishing escalation in tuition. As the economics of post-secondary education shifted, sympathy for IEHPs dropped considerably. Political will to do something of a differential nature to support IEHPs dropped considerably when, quote, our own graduates were having a hard time getting a job and paying off their debts. What was also occurring during 2008, and partly to universities use this as a technique to actually justify rapid increases in tuition, we started to see a period of qualification inflation in many professions. When I qualified as a pharmacist, it was good enough. I got into pharmacy school right out of high school. 4 years later, I graduated with a bachelor's degree. Boom, I am a qualified pharmacist. By the mid-2000s, that had shifted. Now, an aspiring pharmacist needed 2 years at least of undergraduate education in science, followed by 4 years of a doctor of pharmacy education degree. What took me 4 years took in 2008 6 years, and today takes 8 years in order to complete. The same pattern occurred in physical therapy, occupational therapy, nursing, as nursing moved from a diploma to a degree field. What this also did was make the process of establishing educational comparability between international graduates and Canadian graduates even more of a challenge and more of a barrier. At the same time, where sympathy and desire to help was dropping because of self-interested concerns amongst Canadian graduates regarding rapid increases in their university tuition fees and this qualification inflation period. By the early 2010s and recovery from the Great Recession, things actually started to get even more complicated. All of these previous trends were in play, but by the early 2010s, an entirely new cohort entered this arena, so-called CSAs, Canadians who studied abroad. In a variety of fields, for instance, medicine, dentistry, and pharmacy, CSAs were Canadians who did not or could not gain admission to a Canadian education program in their chosen professional field, because going back to the early 1990s, remember, we're not funding enough places for interested and qualified Canadians, and so they're going to other countries. But these are generally Canadian citizens, individuals who are culturally competent as Canadians, have no issues with communication challenge, who are going to other countries, but now are coming back and being treated as international graduates. They became quite a force during this period of time. And this led to increasingly litigious interactions with regulatory bodies, and principles for assessment of CSAs had to equally be applied to IEHPs. And this caused quite a lot of litigation and challenge. What was also happening during this time was an unprecedented scope of practice expansion across many professions, and this directly impacted practice, education, regulation, and employment. Finally, what was also happening at this time, and in response to the economic recovery of the early 2010s, was experimentation with very different funding models, particularly of primary care. In Ontario, we went through a period where we had LINs, local integrated healthcare networks, CCACs, community care access centers, family health groups, family health teams, and there was a strong emphasis on cost containment, not service quality. What this meant was that during this period of time, the needs, interests, and concerns of IEHPs simply fell off the radar. There was a sense of, we got too much going on here, you're going to need to fend for yourselves. By the mid-2010s, there was a very distinct and important shift, again, in thinking and political interest. The early years of working with IEHPs was really focused on licensure. The belief being that if we can overcome barriers to licensure, once you're licensed, there's enough shortages in all of these professions that you'll find a job, we don't need to worry about you. As workforce patterns shifted and shortages were no longer an issue, it increasingly became clear that it was not simply licensure that was an issue anymore, it was employability. Because we were starting to see large numbers of licensed IEHPs who met all regulatory requirements who still couldn't get jobs. What this started to mean was that there was a perceptible change in emphasis. Instead of funding programs to get people licensed, government was interested in funding programs to get people working. And we started to see a shift towards a vocabulary of alternative career strategies. You know what? You're licensed as a doctor, you're not licensed as a doctor, but you're never going to get a job as a doctor. Why don't you go work at a laser hair remover clinic instead? The idea that we wanted to ensure people had jobs, not licenses, shifted very dramatically the nature of supports that were provided during this period of time. By the late 2010s, it was not simply employability that was the issue, it was actually integration. Over the intervening 20 years since we started this story, we had seen sufficient increases in university enrollments in a variety of different fields, and we're producing more Canadian grads than ever. Talk of skills shortage is increasingly less important than ever as a political driver for change. This has also led to increasing role of private and for-profit bridging and settlement support programs and accelerated the shift towards alternative career models to address integration issues. If we were still talking about fairness, if we were still talking about skills shortage, we were not getting an audience that was listening or caring about our messages in either government, in the professions, or amongst employers. And then, in March 2020, everything just stopped. All of us remember March 13th, 2020 as the day that the pandemic was officially declared in Canada, and many of us went home, and that was that. Those of us who did not have the luxury of working from home during the 2.5 years of the pandemic understand more than most what's happened since then. The interest of employers, of politicians, of ministries of health, and the Canadian public has really turned now to issues of workforce burnout, the rise of misinformation, blatant sexism, racism, and the growing social acceptability of hostility and violence aimed at healthcare workers, as well as the commensurate shutdown of educational programs and immigration during this time. It's been very difficult for the last 2 years to actually get any kind of political interest in the unique issues faced by IEHPs. So much of the bureaucratic and political interest in health and education has focused on these issues of workforce burnout, the rise of misinformation, and some of these accompanying issues. We are progressively being crowded out of the political agenda because these issues have certainly come to the fore. And what's happening today, as we may or may not be actually exiting our COVIDian times, it's hard to know, but it does seem that the writing is on the wall that what's going to be happening today and in the foreseeable future is a focus on infrastructure collapse. Every day in the newspaper, we see stories about emergency rooms that are closed. We see stories about burned out healthcare workers. We see some attempts to say, hey, IEHPs can solve this problem. But the issue is not one of actually supply and personnel. We could be licensing 1 million IEHPs and 1 million Canadian graduates, but if the healthcare infrastructure in which they work is collapsing, which I believe it actually is, we're just putting them into a black hole, and they too are going to burn out. The issues we face now and in the foreseeable future are unprecedented and represent the strangest constellation of circumstances I've ever seen in my life, and probably most of you have. Simultaneously, we are trying to deal with incredible political blowback and the rise of far-right nativist movements. Fortunately, thus far in Canada, this has not necessarily been accompanied by widespread resentment, hostility, or violence against new Canadians, but in many countries of the world it has been. And sadly, I'm not sure there's anything magical in the air we breathe that will prevent this from occurring in Canada. The rise of these far-right movements make any kind of funding and political advocacy for new Canadians challenging to support. We're also, as we all know, in the midst of an unprecedented economic downdraft, facing problems of inflation and recession, meaning that dollars and support that are spent in some areas come under extraordinary scrutiny. We're also facing unprecedented technological issues, the rise of misinformation, in particular social media and hostility, and all of this is connecting with what sociologists call societal atomization. Early in the story of the IEHP experience in Canada, there were many attempts to motivate political action by appealing to things like fairness, brain waste, those sorts of issues. altruistic, generous impulses of human beings to say, I'm doing okay, I want to help others. So much of what's happened as we're coming out of COVID has pointed to a type of, I don't care about anybody else. I can barely take care of myself. You take care of yourself, and all I want to do is pay less taxes, pay less taxes, pay less taxes. Coupled with all of this, we are seeing an incredible burden on the healthcare system because of delayed and deferred medical care. Particularly in the mental health field, but also in areas like cancer, general health screening, we are seeing unprecedented demand, pent-up demand, because for 2 years, none of us were getting a chance to actually get the primary care we needed. We're also seeing educational issues, years of deferred education and socialization, licensure exams, so many other issues are affecting what's going on. Unfortunately, while any one of these issues is significant, the fact that we seem to be experiencing all of them simultaneously means that the infrastructure that is collapsing is not only hospital emergency rooms. Our regulatory bodies and regulatory systems, our legal systems, and the social and ethical compacts that govern respectful discourse among citizens is also simultaneously collapsing. The issue of pressing importance today to politicians, policymakers, educators, employers is one of this simultaneous collapse of so many of the institutions that we have trusted and lived by quite effectively for the last 60 or 70 years. And as a result, where political emphasis is going to have to be is not on individuals, but on building institutions, rebuilding institutional credibility, rebuilding institutional support and society. The way we do that is completely unclear, but it is consuming all the oxygen that perhaps in the past may have been offered to IEHPs who are struggling to find their foothold on the ladder. We know the healthcare workforce is sick, stressed, and burned out as never before. We know that public safety personnel, ambulance drivers, 911 call-in center workers, police, fire, the people who compromise their safety to keep us safe, they're even in worse straits than the general healthcare workforce. Political chaos, paralysis, and polarization is a reality that now most of us know exists, but don't know what to do anything about. And on top of that, we're especially in the healthcare system dealing with the strangest series of unresolved drug and medical supply chain disruptions that are also compromising the effectiveness of what we can do. We're seeing the diversion of many healthcare resources to mass vaccination and personal protective equipment needs. And we're living through a period that's been simultaneously called the Great Resignation, as anybody in their 50s who can is getting out of the healthcare workforce as fast as they can, and the Great Inflation, where our economic system is under stress as never before. And many of us who maybe thought we were comfortable middle-class professionals are looking at gas prices and food prices and going, how are we going to make this work? So through this evolution, some things are remaining constant. IEHPs are here. They are a large and growing proportion of the Canadian workforce. And we know that today, as 25 years ago, healthcare would simply stop if all the IEHPs suddenly disappeared, or if no IEHPs continued to be licensed and employed. This is still important. But we also know that IEHPs are facing disproportionate brunts of the racist, sexist, verbal, and physical abuse that's leading to burnout. I don't know of any studies that have been done, but I would suspect that simply putting more IEHPs in the front lines without actually addressing the infrastructural collapse issues means that we're going to simply be exposing them to much more abuse than ever before. It's not going to solve the problems. IEHPs may have the capacity to endure negative workplace conditions better because they don't have the luxury of even thinking about the Great Resignation. What we also know is that IEHPs' career trajectories simply do not match Canadians or even Canadian who studies abroad, their pathways. There are so many issues that have faced and continue to face IEHPs. And I would argue that every single issue we've talked about today continues to be relevant. It's just that the political emphasis has changed. Fairness is still a problem. Skills shortage and brain waste is still a problem. But if all we're doing is focusing our energies on talking about those issues, we're not going to get the audiences we need to be mobilized and politically engaged to affect change. I would suggest that where we need to change our tone and address the more pressing needs is to think about how we can think about infrastructural collapse, not from an individual IEHP level. I don't think it's profitable, despite what the media is reporting out and saying, why don't we just accelerate licensure of internationally qualified nurses and that will solve our problem? I don't believe that will. And in fact, it may be unethical to toss internationally educated nurses into the firing lines in these ways. We need to be part of a solution. This community listening to this webinar needs to be part of the solution to address the collapse of institutional credibility and the infrastructural collapse that's going on in front of our eyes that will affect each and every one of us. So, where do we go from here? The headline story is going to be on health system collapse in the years ahead, I believe. And this is both an opportunity but a threat for IEHPs if we don't get our messaging right. Scope of practice evolution is going to continue and accelerate considerably as a short-term countermeasure to collapse, and that also represents opportunities and threats for IEHPs. Some of the more important but difficult issues we're going to all need to get our heads around involve the economic and political polarization and pressure issues, and these are things that affect all of us, not simply IEHPs. What do I hope you take away from this presentation and perhaps spawn some discussion? What I hope I've helped to highlight is that the driver of interest in IEHPs from a political and funding perspective has changed considerably over the last 25 years and is going to continue to change. Those of us in this field doing this work need to understand what the perspectives are of funders, politicians, policymakers, practitioners, employment, and the general public, because we need to adjust our messaging to make sure that we are actually solving those problems and not problems from 10 years ago. Is there a moral then to all of this story? Political expediency and current pressures have been the driver of the IEHP story for 25 years. It is always a fool's errand to try to forecast future trends, but it's something we're going to need to think about. And in the midst of this most difficult of times, this time of sort of ruin and collapse, there are the seeds and opportunities for regeneration. And if we can be opportunistic and strategic, IEHPs can be front and center in that part of that story. Thank you so much for your interest and coming for today. I look forward to questions, discussion, and an opportunity to share some of your reflections on the presentation. I'll turn it over to Colleen and Andrew to see what kind of questions have been coming through.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. Austin. That was fantastic. And we have 119 attendees with us here today listening in attentively. And I really enjoyed your focus and how you mentioned it's so important to evolve with these changing times, and that our messaging of removing barriers to employment really does need to evolve and change as we move forward. So thank you for that focus. That's fantastic. And we do have some questions that have come in. So we'll jump into those, and please keep those questions coming for Dr. Austin. So you touched briefly on the alternative care pathways for IEHPs, and I really just wanted for you to share your thoughts on the benefits or disadvantages to that.
Yep. So the whole concept of alternative pathways or alternative careers, it was a short-term attempt by governments to solve the political problem and the bad optics of why are there doctors driving taxi cabs. The pinch points, particularly in the medical licensure process, are significant. And there's not, for over 25 years, there haven't been enough attempts to actually address those pinch points along the way. Alternative careers were seen as a way of solving the political problem, of newspaper headlines and terrible stories in the press about qualified people who weren't getting good jobs. Because at least if you had a job, may not be, maybe you were a head surgeon at a hospital in Kabul, but now you're not driving a taxi. You're doing some kind of healthcare work because you're working in a lab instead. Some would argue that the whole vocabulary of it was incredibly disrespectful. Others would argue at least it's a job. When 18% of medical subspecialists who qualified in Canada aren't getting jobs, at least it's a job. It's a very difficult issue to address. I think it's, in my personal opinion, is I did not appreciate the force with which alternative careers, I think, were pushed. There was so much money available for alternative career programming from various governments during a period of time, but that was money that was not made available to address the pinch points in the licensure process. It sort of faded in prominence, I would say, over time. It certainly is something that's still talked about, and I think it's a complicated issue to sort of to untangle.
Thank you so much, Dr. Austin. That's hugely helpful. So we'll move on to our next question. So how does Canada's history dealing with leveraging IEHPs compare to other immigrant receiving countries? And secondary, is there a country that stands out in integrating IEHPs in their healthcare system?
So I'd say in the Anglosphere, sort of major English-speaking countries, my reading of all this would say I think Canada is far and away the most enlightened, the most progressive, and the most successful. Not simply in terms of integrating IHPs, but with immigration in general, certainly compared to the United States or other places. It's oftentimes said it's easier to immigrate to Canada, but harder to get licensed in Canada. It's incredibly difficult to immigrate to the United States, but once you're there, it seems to be easier to get licensed. Mm-hmm. The country that's probably had the greatest success, strangely, with integration of IEHPs in their workforce is the Gulf state of Qatar.
Okay.
Ever heard of Qatar? You may know it simply because it's got a stranglehold on natural gas production. It's a Gulf emirate with a very small population of Qataris and a very large expatriate population. But they have one of the most interesting healthcare systems. They have a superb, better than first world healthcare system that is entirely populated by IEHPs. Qatari citizens don't become healthcare professionals. They just don't. Very few of them ever do. And so their entire system is populated by IEHPs, and probably of any jurisdiction I know of, they have the most sophisticated systems for expediting licensure, employment, and integration of a very diverse array of IEHPs into their healthcare workforce. It's a fascinating story. It's a very problematic story because part of it, especially for less educated members of the workforce, if you are a surgeon, you'll be fine in Qatar. If you're a personal support worker, you're kind of an indentured servant. So there are a lot of issues there, and but it's an interesting story in terms of a country you wouldn't necessarily think of that's had success with integration of IHPs.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. What would you recommend as an immediate solution as we try to address this issue? That's a tough one, but...
Yeah. I think if we collectively can shift our perspectives away from employability and licensure, and it's going to be all hands on board around this infrastructure collapse issue. See, I am very, very cautious about some of the rhetoric emerging now about how let's expedite licensure. We have shortages in emergency rooms. If we can find quick ways of getting foreign trained nurses educated, they'll start working tomorrow and that'll solve our problem. It won't. There's something to me almost fundamentally unethical about throwing internationally educated nurses into the firing line that is frontline healthcare today. We need to address the fundamental problems, the infrastructure collapse issues, in a way that actually is meaningful. And I know that might not be an expeditious or a popular thing with this audience, because for many of you, your funding might actually be contingent on how many people get jobs, how many people get licensed. But I think that very short-term focus is actually problematic. I think what it means is we really need to look at how are we going to rebuild a regulatory infrastructure, a regulatory structure around recognition of international experience. It's 50 years out of date. Its focus on keeping Canadians safe is so antiquated. And I think because of the general collapse going on, there is an appetite for regulators to figure out how we can't do the way things we've done it in the past. This is where I think we can contribute very meaningfully at the regulatory renewal level.
Fantastic. Thank you for giving us that perspective. And then our next question, let's see. So for those of us speaking with governments on this issue, what would your top line message to government be as it relates to IEHPs and the current environment?
Yeah, I would go back to that infrastructure collapse issue. Infrastructure collapse doesn't mean skill shortage. And there's going to be a strong tendency to think, oh, you work with IHPs? Great. If we expedite licensure, you can plug these holes. But you're going to plug the holes and the dam is still going to bust. And I think helping policymakers and governments recognize that where we can have some real meaningful impact is in regulation, reform of regulatory practices. Mm-hmm. That's where the much more enduring impact will be. If people on this call could get more directly involved in working with regulators to actually say, this is a time of collapse, we can't do things the way we've been doing things before. How do we rebuild institutional systems so that we're not just putting Band-Aids on for the last, as we have been for the last 50 years?
Mm-hmm. Thank you for outlining that for us. There's lots of individuals on the call today listening to your advice, so thank you. And then it looks like we have related again. So should we be doing more lobbying with the province, medical associations, and other regulatory bodies to soften the inclusion of foreign trained healthcare professionals?
Sure. Yeah, sure. It's not going to hurt, right. But I don't think lobbying in that tone is necessarily going to be effective. Okay. If the problem that is top of mind for the people who have the money and the power to affect change is focused on the entire system is collapsing. By the system, I don't just mean emergency rooms. It's regulatory bodies, educational institutions, employers. Everything is simultaneously melting down. Unless our lobbying is calibrated in a way that actually recognizes this is a really big problem, it's not just IEHPs who potentially could get licensed that we have to offer. We actually have a perspective on necessary system change to slow down this collapse and hopefully prevent it from happening in the future. That's the kind of, I think, language that will gain greater interest than simply, hey, let's change what we've been doing for 50 years in the short term to get nurses working in Emerge.
Mm-hmm. Understood. Thank you. The next question. So we're seeing a lot of pressure on regulators to expedite licensure for Ukrainian healthcare providers. Do you think this might create that opportunity for regulators to look into recognizing they can have a better legislation?
That's a great question. Lamentably, I would say perhaps the answer to that is yes, and it's an opportunity we perhaps should not overlook. I say lamentably because one of the things that you oftentimes would hear during the start of the Ukraine, this in no way is meaning to discount the horrendous situation that's going on in Ukraine right now. But much of the public sympathy around the Ukrainian situation was framed in the context of, wow, these people look just like us. This notion that you had a relatively middle class, predominantly white population that was involved in a war has driven a level of political interest and political will to change things that when we had a bunch of Afghan refugees or Syrian refugees wasn't there to quite the same level. And so we take our opportunities, I guess, where we get it. But I do think that the experience of accelerating integration of a Ukrainian workforce in Canada might offer some very useful lessons to carry forward for more meaningful regulatory reform.
Fantastic. Thank you. I'm just keeping an eye on the time. I think we have time for a few more questions, so I'll just launch into those. How does the lack of accurate data about the HHR crisis and IEHPs journeys affect the decisions made? Will it affect the strategic solutions that need to be implemented?
Yes, simple answer. We have woefully inadequate health human resources data. It is definitely getting better, but we don't have a national commitment to track this out. Even within the province, we don't have this. Even within a city, I'm sitting in downtown Toronto now, and there isn't even a good way for Toronto General Hospital to share its HHR data with Mount Sinai Hospital across the street, to say that, you're having a shortage of nurses in this area. Maybe we can read it. These are two large teaching hospitals right across the street from each other, and they can't share data. We are far too slowly, building that information sort of gateway and that data set that we need to have a more informed view of what's actually happening.
Excellent. Just seeing if there's anything else we can squeeze in, and we will take the additional questions that we don't get to with Dr. Austin today offline, but I think we can pop in potentially one more. So would it be possible to have uniform licensure requirements throughout the country?
Australia is a great example of a jurisdiction that went from a system very similar to ours, where each state in Australia had its own little fiefdoms, and now they have a national approach to this. If there's political will, it can be done. And certainly the Australian example says that it should be done from a cost effectiveness, cost efficiency perspective, from a fairness perspective, and a capacity to actually help rebuild a collapsing provincial infrastructure.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Austin, for taking the time to participate in today's discussion, and obviously sending out many thanks to our audience for joining us and engaging with us today. And obviously, we will have some additional upcoming events. So if you'll just bear with me for one moment, I'll pop up our closing slides, and we'll just run through those. Excellent. Okay. So if you missed any part of today's presentation, or you would like to watch the session again, we will post the recording on the N4 platform within the next week. And we want to continue the dialogue. This panel has started, and the discussion with Dr. Austin, and we will be moving all questions, as I mentioned, to our meeting place, and we'll have those responses for you. We also have curated several resources related to today's webinar topic, and you can find these in our resource toolkit. We'll link them when we share the on-demand version of the discussion. So if you haven't yet, please sign up for newcomernavigation.ca for all of our resources and learning opportunities. Following today's session, you will be invited to complete a survey to share your feedback with N4. Highly valuable. These surveys help us continuously improve and seek out new webinar content and opportunities that are responsive to topics you're interested in. We kindly ask that you follow the link and complete this brief survey. And please, if you haven't already, check out the N4 mobile app available on Apple and Android devices throughout the QR code here by going to newcomernavigation.ca/iOS or Android. And thank you again. We hope you can join us for a future N4 event. Stay safe and well. Thank you so much, Dr. Austin.